Well, good to have you here. Diving into this awesome new series, and like Derek said, warn you right up front. It's going to really hit home. All of it will have an impact on some of us somewhere, including myself, in our lives, and it's such an important and valuable topic to dive into. Peter Scazzaro, who is a pastor and author in New York City, in his book, The Emotionally Healthy Church, he talks about the founder of World Vision, which is the world's largest relief and development organization. And he talks in this book about the founder and how the founder was a man who was sold out for God. I mean, he genuinely loved God with all his heart and committed his entire life to serving God. He was passionate about making change in the world. And so some of the friends of this gentleman would say things like, he's a man restless to win souls, that they've never seen a person with greater compassion, and that he's a true Christian Samaritan. So no doubt this was a man of God. This was a man with a heart for God, a passion for the world, and wanted to do great things, and did great things for God. No question, no doubt about it. Unfortunately, in the process of doing great things for God, this man wrecked his marriage, his family, and his own personal health and life. And so the story about this man talks about how there was so much stress and tension, and he was traveling so much around the world doing God's work that there was a period of time in his marriage where for about 2 years he and his wife were hardly speaking to each other because he was away so much and just the stress and the tension between them. There was another time in his life when he was away where one of his children, a daughter, called him up and pleaded and begged with him, "Daddy, come home. I need you to be home." But he was so busy and so caught up in his work and in God's work that he couldn't just jump on a plane from wherever he was in the world and fly home. And then this young girl attempted suicide. Unfortunately, she wasn't successful that time. But 2 years later, she tried again and took her life. This man's health went down the tubes. This man's relationships, his family, everything kind of was affected by just how overcommitted he was to God's work, but at the same time not looking inward to the work that needed to be done on the inside of him. So in the end, this man, his passion, it wrecked so many different things in his life. He ultimately had to step down, was asked to step down from the organization that he was the founder of. Things had gotten so bad. This man left the legacy of World Vision that we've all heard of and are familiar with, but he lost sight of his own family, his own health, his own life in the process. I'm guessing that your story and my story is not quite as drastic as all that, but we each have a story. We each have something that we've been through or are going through that in some way or another can relate to this man's experience. And all of us want to show and reveal the appearance of health and strength on the surface of our lives, while at the same time trying to manage a tsunami of emotional turmoil under the surface. We all have been through those kinds of times. So this series, Iceberg Ahead, it identifies the symptoms of emotionally unhealthy lives, and then it offers necessary steps to work towards the healing that we all need in our lives so that we can live out of that health and that strength that God has for us, and so that we can live beneath the surface transformational lives. So, speaking of icebergs, and you'll hear me talk about icebergs quite a bit in this series, what would you say is the most well-known iceberg in the world? The one that sank the Titanic. Absolutely. I think we would all agree, right? That's probably the most well-known, famous iceberg in the world. Interestingly enough, there is a picture of that iceberg. Now, this is not yet on the screen here, but there is a photograph of the iceberg that sank the Titanic. I kid you not, it actually has been verified by survivors of the Titanic. And so this picture was taken by a lady who was traveling on the ship that rescued the Titanic. And several people have verified, yeah, that's the iceberg that sank the Titanic. Now, what's really, really interesting and has absolutely nothing to do with the series is that the woman who took that photograph in the North Atlantic in 1912 is from Galt, Ontario. Isn't that cool? That means something to those of us who are from this area now, but I thought that was such a cool thing as well. You know, it's common knowledge that an iceberg has 90%, approximately 90% below the surface, and so just the 10% on the surface. And so that's something that is very familiar or similar to our lives as well, because just like an iceberg, the 90% below the surface of our lives is really the bulk of who we are, right? It's not just the 10% that people see on the surface, it's the 90% below the surface that is the bulk of who we are. And so in this series, we're going to discover that our 90% below the surface has some real life-giving qualities. Your 90% below the surface has powerful life-giving qualities and potential to impact the world around you, to impact yourself, your family, wherever you go. But that 90% of us below the surface also has the power to sink ships. Right? It's that hidden part below the surface that has so much potential one way or another to do so much good, but also, if it's not healthy, to cause so much harm. So, I want to talk about what it means to go beneath the surface and look at those areas of our lives. Because of the way that I was raised, my upbringing, whether it's been traditional Christian home and in a traditional province like Newfoundland, or my own personality, and I'm sure a number of other factors, for me, my 10% above the surface of my life is fairly clean-cut, fairly socially refined, fairly predictable and non-threatening. I mean, I typically, when I approach people, I don't really scare people. I'm kind of safe. For the most part, mostly safe. But that does not mean that what's beneath the surface of my life is necessarily healthy or stable. That does not mean that just because I have it kind of looking good on the surface, that there isn't stuff going on beneath the surface that's a different picture. Now, I'm not suggesting that I'm psychotic or kind of a psychopath or anything like that. Shut up, I told you not to say that. But what it does mean, sorry, I just threw that in there. Seriously, no. What it does mean is that for all of us, we have stuff beneath the surface. So whether you're the type of person that tends to wear your emotions on your sleeve, or you're the type of person that kind of keeps your emotions kind of neatly tucked away in a nice little categories, we all have stuff beneath the surface, stuff that we don't reveal to other people. And even if you're the type of person who says, you know what you see is what you get, I guarantee you there's more beneath the surface. There always is more beneath the surface. So the main idea of this message today and this series that we're going to look at for the next few weeks is that what lies beneath the surface of our lives is governed by our emotional and our spiritual health. That stuff that's below the surface is governed by our emotional and our spiritual health. So the underlying premise of this series is that our emotional health and our spiritual maturity are inseparable. Our emotional health and our spiritual maturity go hand in hand. They work together. They're two sides of the same coin. To put it another way, it's not possible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. Now let that kind of sink in and roll around a little bit. Because when I first read that, I started to question that a little bit. But the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. It's not possible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. I'm guessing that you and I, we probably don't consider ourselves to be emotionally or spiritually immature. Well, consider a couple of questions. Do you ever avoid healthy conflict in order to keep the peace? Why do you do that? Do you sometimes suppress your true emotions so that people will like and accept you? What's with that? Do you live with unhealthy boundaries and limits on your time, your habits, and your relationships? As Dr. Phil would say, how's that working for you? See, we all have emotional and spiritual immaturity issues. But we can sometimes pretend really, really well. And so this message is not meant to heap any kind of guilt or condemnation on any one of us, because I need to say this to myself as well. It's so that we would take a look deeper under the surface and see what we need to see so that we can live out of the best version of ourselves that we can. In a first century letter to the church in Ephesus in modern-day Turkey, the Apostle Paul wrote about being mature. And so Paul explains that Jesus works through the church, his body, in order to reveal the wisdom and the purpose of God. And in order for that to happen, the church needs to be in a healthy place. It needs to be equipped or prepared for works of service, Paul says, so that the church will be built up. And then he says, until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become, in every respect, the mature body of Christ. That's the journey we're all on. We're all on this journey to become mature in Christ. So basically, Paul is saying that when followers of Jesus grow up, they should look like Jesus. As we mature, we should start to sound more like Jesus, act more like Jesus, love more like Jesus. And so our lives mature in His image. And that applies not only to our spiritual lives, but our emotional lives, because our emotional health and our spiritual maturity are inseparable. They go hand in hand. So, if you're not a follower of Jesus, if you're kind of maybe just starting to think about what that might look like in your life, in your experience, this is still a really good and necessary message for you, because the bottom line is our emotions are a fundamental part of our humanity. Our emotions are at the core of who we are. And so it's something valuable for all of us to consider. What does that look like as I look beneath the surface of my life? So the bulk of this series is taken from a resource by Peter Scazzaro, who I mentioned earlier, called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. Now, I've called it Iceberg Ahead. And so throughout the series, we're going to use the image of an iceberg to kind of capture some of the truth of what it means to look beneath the surface and then to live that authentic life from the health that we gain. Let me ask this question. Has anyone ever seen an actual iceberg? Kind of live? Yeah, a few of you have. Cool. Nice. Awesome. Well, I'm from the East Coast, and so I've seen I've seen a few icebergs, and there's just something about an iceberg, especially the bigger they are. We have one on the screen here. There's just something about an iceberg that is just so breathtaking. It's so incredible and so amazing. It really captures your attention. So icebergs are beautiful, they're majestic, and they're intriguing. But something about icebergs is that they're also mysterious, volatile, and dangerous. An iceberg that looks so beautiful can split and crack, and large chunks fall off at any second, or they can flip over and cause all kinds of damage to boats, ships, obviously the Titanic, right? So there's all this mystery and volatile and danger about an iceberg. As we compare ourselves to icebergs, you and I are also beautiful, majestic, and intriguing. We're made in God's image. We're made in God's image. So whether or not you think or feel that way, you are beautiful, majestic, and intriguing. That's the way God made you. However, like an iceberg, you and I are also mysterious, volatile, and dangerous to ourselves and to the people around us. And so we need to look at what's beneath the surface for that reason. So, are you ready to look beneath the surface at your 90%? I really got you geared up and excited to take that look. I know for some people this is okay. Yeah, you're comfortable with this. You're an introspective person. Yeah, I've done this before. I don't mind taking a deeper look. Other people's like, wow, this is new territory. This is not a place I am comfortable going. I really would rather not take that deeper look. But you're here now. So let's just go for it. Scazzaro identifies 10 symptoms of emotionally unhealthy spirituality. And again, if you're not a follower of Christ, just consider the practical application of some of these concepts. What I want to do is I'm going to list those 10 symptoms in the order that he gives them in his book. And then I want to kind of expand on them a little bit further after that. So very quickly, if you're taking notes, they'll come up one by one in a few seconds here. But very quickly, here are the 10 symptoms of unhealthy spirituality. Using God to run from God, ignoring anger, sadness, and fear, dying to the wrong things, denying the impact of the past on the present, dividing life into secular and sacred, doing for God instead of being with God, spiritualizing away conflict, covering over brokenness, weakness, and failure, living without limits, judging other people's spiritual journey. So I want to go through these a little slower. And as I read this list, I identified 3 categories that I think these can fall into. And so these 3 categories will help us kind of capture it a little better and make it a little more manageable so that we can take that deeper look that we need to look at. And so the 3 categories are doing, denying, and dividing. Okay? So here's what I want to do. As we take a closer look, I want you to use your imagination, because again, some of you are okay with this sort of thing. Others, this is kind of scary and new territory. I want to use your imagination. Imagine you're putting on some scuba gear. You're putting on a mask, an oxygen tank, some flippers, and you're going to take a dive beneath the surface of the iceberg to see what's down there. Okay? And this is a safe environment for us to do that. Okay? We're just going to take a look beneath the surface. And as we do that, as you take that deep breath and we dive below the surface, I want you to ask yourself, what do you see? What resonates with you? What kind of stands out as, yeah, that kind of is something I can see in me, and something that I might be struggling with or dealing with below the surface? So again, doing, denying, or dividing. Again, this is not to in any way to put guilt or condemnation, but to help us to look at our lives and to discover ways that we can grow and mature. So first of all, doing. Number 1, 3, 6, and 9 fall into the category of doing. Number 1 is using God to run from God. So ask yourself this question. Do I fill my life with church or godly activities or the issues of others while avoiding dealing with the difficult issues of my own life? You ever catch yourself doing that? Possibly on a regular basis? Maybe you're a giver, a doer, a go-getter, a get-her-done person, a make-it-happen kind of person. And that's not a bad thing. But are you doing that at the expense of your own health? Emotional and spiritual health. Using God to run from God. Number 3 is dying to the wrong things. This is the question. Do I die to happiness and the good things of life, thinking that's what selflessness and suffering for Jesus means? See, many people that were raised in the church were raised to be martyrs. That somehow dying for Christ, taking up your cross and following Christ means you got to die to everything. And then what happens sometimes is that some people die to everything so much that they die to the true part of who they are. They die to their own emotional and spiritual well-being. Do you sometimes put your own needs on hold in order to help other people? If you do that on a regular basis, inevitably you're working out of a very unhealthy place, dying to the wrong things. Number 6, doing for God instead of being with God. Here's the question you can ask. Do I evaluate my spirituality based on how much I do for God and on being a good person? I've spoken with a lot of people, both Christian and non-Christian, who they kind of evaluate their lives based on the good they do. I'm a good person because, and they list the good things that they do. And there's a part of that that's okay. You know, it's good to recognize the value in that. But if that's how you base or determine your spiritual health on how much you do, then it's going to run into some problems for you. Because if you start to feel like you're not healthy, or am I really, is everything okay with me and God? Are we good spiritually? Am I doing okay? And if you don't feel like you are, then you start doing more things. And you just get consumed in doing more, and you're not actually looking at the areas that are not healthy. Number 9, living without limits. Do I have a habit of trying to do it all or biting off more than I can chew? Do I just go without taking time to stop and actually deal with and help yourself be healthier and stronger? So these are all examples of doing. There's a book called the Poisonwood Bible, and it's written by a daughter of a missionary. And she tells the story of her dad who took his wife and his young children into the jungles of Africa, in the Congo, I believe. And he was a real doer. And he was just on fire for God and just wanted to do the best he could do as a missionary, which is a good thing. And he went in. The problem was that in all his doing, he never did any self-reflecting, and he never really looked at some of the key issues of his own family or his own personal life. And sometimes he even ignored the concerns and the issues of the people that he was there to try to serve and help. And so a couple of examples of how that played out in his life and in his family's life is that when he would win someone to the Lord and he would get a conversion, he would want a baptism right away. That's biblical. That's what we do. And so he would want to baptize them in the river. But he totally ignored the fact that the people were terrified of the crocodiles in the river. And so just to walk out, waist high in the river and just stand there and kind of have a pastor kind of say a bunch of words and a bunch of people gathered on the shore was terrifying for them. He totally ignored the fact that they were scared of that sort of thing. And they needed to be walked through that. And it was just like, no, this is what we do. You get saved, you get baptized. And it was all about the doing. And he ignored and kind of missed some of the other concerns. For his own wife, as a young mom and wife, she was very scared and afraid of being in this strange environment and with these strange people and the customs and concern for her young children and feeling isolated and alone and so many different feelings. And so when she would try to talk about those things, he would just sit there kind of stone-faced and say, well, we're doing God's work. We're missionaries. This is what we do. And so it was so much about the doing, but at the expense of actually recognizing some of the fears and concerns along the way. And then the title of the book, Poisonwood Bible, apparently in that particular culture, the language is one of those tonal languages where a word, if it's just spoken a slightly different way, takes on a totally different meaning. And so apparently the word glorious, when spoken with his American accent, was actually poisonwood tree. And so after every message, this missionary who loved the Lord and wanted to do as much as he can for the Lord would get up and he would say, Jesus is glorious. But with his American accent, the people were actually hearing was, Jesus is poisonwood. And so the daughter tells how he spent his whole life preaching this gospel of poisonwood. And so for us, for you, if you're a doer, and many of us here, I think, are doers. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Being a doer is not a bad thing. We need to be doers. But if you're a doer at the expense of your own health or the health of those closest to you, you might be proclaiming this glorious gospel, but what are people hearing? What are people seeing and experiencing? Are you a doer? Are you a doer at the expense of your health, your emotional and spiritual health? The second category is denying. This is number 2, 4, and 8. Number 2 is ignoring anger, sadness, and fear, or any number of other emotions for that matter. Here's the question. Am I dishonest with myself or others by denying my true hurts, feelings, and disappointments? You find yourself being dishonest with yourself and others by denying what you truly think and feel inside. I call this smile of denial. Kind of putting on the happy face on the outside, the 10%. But there's so much going on below the surface that you're trying to stuff down and deny. Number 4 is denying the impact of the past on the future. This is a big one for so many of us. Here's the question. Do I deny how the people and experiences of the past continue to shape and impact my life today? Your family of upbringing, your past experiences, certain failures that you've experienced or things that were done to you. We all have our story. But do you deny those things, deny the impact that they've had on you, and just try to motor on? And again, sometimes as church people in particular, we're almost taught that you just gotta keep going. God is good. And you just kind of end up stuffing all that stuff down, denying it, and just motor on. Push through it. God is faithful. And we have a verse that kind of qualifies the denying that we sometimes do. This one is so important that we're actually going to spend a full message on this idea of looking back in order to move forward. And a big part of it is forgiveness. Either receiving the forgiveness ourselves that we need, or forgiving another person for something that they've done that caused us such hurt. Number 8 is covering over brokenness, weakness, and failure. The question, do I overcompensate for my weaknesses, my failures, and brokenness by trying to appear confident, right, and in control? Sometimes we want to put on such a positive front that we end up denying some of our own feelings of weakness and insecurity or inferiority, or just the fact that we don't know, by trying to solve other people's problems or have the right answer or do the right thing or maintain a sense of control. But in the process, we're denying. I'll be honest with you that this one is the one that I struggle with the most, denying my emotions. The unspoken message in my family growing up, at least the one that I heard in my head, was that emotions are bad, dangerous. At the very best, they're unpredictable. And so I learned to deny my emotions. We were just at someone's 50th birthday party last night, and at the end of the night, they set off a ton of fireworks, some of the best fireworks I've ever seen. It's like just a birthday party. But what's interesting is that he didn't announce that he was doing this. He just started lighting them, and so we're gathered out, and he's got a huge property, and we're gathered outside, and a big crowd of us, and we're just mixing and mingling and talking and visiting, and suddenly these gunshots and this bright light happening all the way around us, and he's literally about 50 feet away from us. And Lynn and I are at the front of this crowd, and suddenly we're shocked with what's going on. So once we realize what it is, and we kind of adjust, and we stand back and start to enjoy the fireworks, it got a little bit better. But then, as he's leaning in to light the various clusters of fireworks, one of them explodes. And instead of shooting straight up, the thing explodes out. And it was terrifying. And so it was so unexpected and so crazy and dangerous. And so for the rest of the fireworks, I'm kind of looking up at the fireworks, but I'm also looking at where he is to see if anything is going to shoot at me. Because now I'm scared that the potential of this kind of flying at us kind of a thing is very real. And that's what my emotions and my view of emotional things were like growing up. And it's something that I've had to deal with over time, is that emotions are dangerous and they're so unpredictable. And that although they can be fun and exciting at times, you just never know when it's going to explode in your face. And so my thing was to deny my emotions, pretend that they weren't there or that they weren't important. The problem with denying our emotions, though, is that they're a core part of who we are. So if we end up denying what we truly feel inside, we're denying a part of who we are. We're denying self in a bad way, not in a healthy way. And the thing about pushing our emotions down and denying them is that they don't disappear. They're still there, and they come out one way or another. Am I right? You can stuff them down all you want, but they ooze out somewhere. Whether it's a bad habit or an addiction or anger, depression, one way or another, our emotions, they come out. And so denying them is not healthy. It's not good. The third category is dividing. Number 5 is dividing life into secular and sacred compartments. Here's the question. Do I focus on God during Christian activities, but not really include Him in the rest of life? Kind of think about God and kind of include Him kind of in the Sunday things that you do, maybe a small group, but when it comes to your work or your school or your social life or your entertainment, God's kind of not really a part of that. And so we separate secular and sacred. It's believing in Christian values, but not necessarily applying them to all of life. Number 7 is spiritualizing away conflict. Do I separate or downplay my personal convictions and values to avoid conflict with others, and all in the name of keeping the peace? Which, as I'm sure you've heard before, we were never told to keep the peace. We're not told to be peacekeepers. We're told to be peacemakers, and that's a very different thing, right? But sometimes, especially as church people, as Christian people, we think that we have to somehow keep our mouths shut. We don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to stir the pot. We don't want to stir up the hornet's nest. And so we don't really let people know what we're truly thinking or feeling, or really stick to our values and our opinions as much as we should sometimes. And so we spiritualize away some of that and kind of separate it out and keep it at a distance so that we can try to keep the peace or help everyone to feel comfortable, to like us. Number 10 is judging other people's spiritual journeys. Am I preoccupied and bothered by the faults of others to the point where I keep them at arm's length? And this is kind of the us versus them type of approach to life. That keeping people, or sometimes keeping our values and our convictions at arm's length. We believe it, but for different reasons, we kind of want to keep it somewhat away or separated out. I knew a man who was very active in his church, a man of God, and he prayed on a regular basis, and people respected him, and he was talked about God a lot. He would witness to anybody, anytime, anywhere kind of thing, and he tried to kind of live by certain moral codes and values. And if he had a conversation, it turned to be about the Bible or about Jesus. His favorite topic was the end times, which is all good and fine. But unfortunately, when this man was home, he was both verbally and physically abusive to his wife and kids. And again, he had somehow separated out something that was going on inside him and trying to uphold one image in one place, but a different image somewhere else. I want to give a couple of qualifying statements as we kind of wrap up this section of the message. Because some of you are probably thinking, okay, these are all very extreme examples. And you may not necessarily, wonder where you're going to fit into the whole thing. You might not necessarily see yourself completely in one of those categories. A couple qualifying statements. As a doer, what I'm not saying is that you shouldn't be a doer. We all need to be doers. And some are gifted by God to be doing more and just have a greater sense of doing, and just that's part of your makeup, part of who you are. So it's not about not doing. It's about not ignoring your own emotional and spiritual health in the process of all that you do, and getting so wrapped up in the doing that you ignore those other areas. When it comes to denying, I'm not suggesting that there are times when we shouldn't put on a smiley face. We all have to do that from time to time. There are sometimes you can't go around and just blurt out everything you're thinking and feeling anytime to anyone. That's not wise or healthy for anybody. Sometimes we have to put on the smiley face and just smile the next mile and just go for it and just believe that, yep, God's going to see me through this. I'm just going to keep smiling. But if you're using your smile for denial, then that's a different story. And then when it comes to dividing, you know what? Sometimes we need to have those healthy boundaries. Sometimes we need to kind of keep certain people or circumstances at arm's length so that we can more effectively deal with what needs to be dealt with. And so we have to have those boundaries, and I think God gives us wisdom to know how to set them up and maneuver through. But if we're keeping people or circumstances at arm's length in a way to avoid on an ongoing basis, then that's a different story. So to summarize these three categories: doing, denying, and dividing. Doing for God instead of dwelling with God for your emotional and spiritual health. That's doing. Denying is denying instead of dealing with your emotional and spiritual health. And dividing is dividing life into manageable parts instead of displaying signs of emotional or spiritual weakness. We're going to touch on those in a couple of minutes here when we wrap up. So, we've been under the water for a while. kind of heavy stuff. I want you to come up, take off your mask and your oxygen tank, breathe some real fresh air for a second. Remember, this is a safe place, non-threatening. Just breathe. Okay? What's the point in all this? Why do we need to look beneath the surface? Why even go there? Why not just, do our best moving forward? Well, we can learn some pretty valuable lessons from icebergs, believe it or not. And so here are 4 things from icebergs and those that study icebergs that help us to see why it's important for us to take that under the surface look at our own lives. First of all, something called growlers and bergy bits. That's the technical term, I kid you not, for chunks of ice that break off of icebergs. Growlers and bergy bits. Climate scientists study the way that icebergs break up so that they can get a better understanding of how the climate is affecting the Arctic ice shelf. And so they study these little bits and pieces of ice that break up, called growlers and bergy bits. So for us, as we compare our lives to icebergs, we all have growlers and bergy bits, which are little bits and pieces of our lives that break off and impact other people or impact ourselves. They might be words, attitudes, actions, little habits. They might play out as sarcasm or criticism. There's different things that happen for all of us. We all have these little bits and pieces of ourselves that are floating around out there. What we need to do is be able to look at those bits and pieces and ask ourselves some very important questions. Why do I feel the way I do when I'm around that person? Why do I feel the way I do when I have to confront somebody about something that's important and serious? Why do I think that or say that in response to that particular topic or question? Why am I feeling the way I am right now? These little bits of our lives need to be looked at because we are affected by the climate around us. And we are affected by the climate of our emotional and spiritual health. And so it's good to look at those growlers and bergy bits. Secondly, oceanographers track icebergs because the cold, fresh water of an iceberg actually influences the ocean climate and currents. Don't ask me how. It just does. So this cold, fresh water from an iceberg, when it's moving along, actually influences the ocean currents and circulation. As we move through life, our lives have an influence on those around us. Our lives have an influence on the environment and the culture and the climate and the currents of life. Your health or lack of health impacts your home. It impacts your workplace. It impacts your school. It impacts your church. It impacts your community. So both your health and your lack of health is there, and it's having an impact on the climate and the culture and the currents around you. Thirdly, this one is so cool. I think this one gives us a lot of hope, a lot of promise. Biologists study icebergs because icebergs, when they melt, actually leak nutrients into the water. And so the surrounding water immediately around an iceberg has all these nutrients in it, and then the water is often teeming with plankton and other ocean life because of those nutrients. And the same is true for us. As we drift through life, there's so much potential and so much good in us that can ooze out as nutrients to others around us. And so there's so much hope and so much promise that when we focus on the 90% of our lives and we live out of a healthy place, these nutrients are touching and impacting and bringing life to so many people around us. And the healthier we are, the better that is for others. And then finally, organizations like the International Ice Patrol use aircraft and satellites to actually track where icebergs are moving. And if they get in the path of the shipping lanes or on traffic in the ocean, then they're able to maneuver through that and get the ships to kind of be aware of what's going on. And so for us, it's important for us to have strategies, systems, and disciplines and even people, close friends in our lives that are going to help us to know when there's potential danger. That maybe as something that we're going through right now is starting to be more and more obvious, and we need to have people and systems and disciplines around us to help us to stay safe and to be healthy and whole ourselves, as well as for those around us. So the purpose of this series is to highlight this big idea that our emotional and spiritual health, what's beneath the surface of our lives, has an incredible influence and impact for good or for harm. And so the 90% is so important for us to look at and to live out of the healthiest place possible. Very briefly, I want to look at Ephesians chapter 4 as we wrap this up. Read this verse again. Paul says, "Until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of Christ." So just look at a few of the words that we can highlight there. It talks about unity. It talks about a knowledge of the Son of God. It talks about our conversation, speaking the truth in love, loving people in a healthy and helpful way, and then growing to become, in every respect, the mature body of Christ. That's our goal in life, to grow into a mature image of who Jesus is. And the more mature and healthy we are, the better influence we can have in the world around us. There's an area in the ocean, and I'll end with this last idea of an iceberg. An area of the ocean from Greenland down the east coast of Labrador and Newfoundland called Iceberg Alley. And it's one of the most highly or densely populated areas with icebergs. And so they're constantly looking in that area and making sure they kind of have an idea of where all these icebergs are and where they're going and if they're getting into the shipping lanes. But if you look on a map and you see just how many of these icebergs there are, it's really quite incredible. But it got me thinking about us as God's people, as God's church. People who want to have a good and positive influence in the world. We can be like an iceberg alley, but in a very positive way. Just imagine if all of us, and we're all on a journey, but if all of us were living out of, serving out of, ministering out of a healthy place, where we're taking that look under the surface, coming to terms with some of the issues that we struggle with, growing and maturing to be more like Jesus. Imagine the impact that we could have like an iceberg alley, that there would be so many of us in healthy ways having such a positive influence, the nutrients that would be pouring out and affecting the world around us because of our own health and well-being. So my challenge to every one of us, myself included, over the next few weeks is to take that important look beneath the surface and to begin to, with God's help, become the healthy and whole people that we can be in Him. And where that's scary for you, and where that's a little intimidating, and where it's going to take a bit more work, know that God is with you every step of the way as He walks us through this series in the next little while. Let me pray. God, I thank You so much for Your promise. I thank You for Your presence. And I thank You, God, that You have such a good plan for all of us. And Lord, sometimes in our weakness, in our humanity, in our inability to sometimes even see what's there, we just keep plugging on. But Lord, You want us to sometimes stop and take a good look and trust You and invite You into those areas of our lives. So I pray that this sermon today, this series, Lord, would just have a powerful impact on all of us as we determine in our hearts that we're going to walk with You and we're going to allow You to just reveal things in us, and that You're going to bring healing and health to us as individuals and to this church and beyond. We thank You for that. In Jesus' name.